I'm excited to introduce Rob Cross, an author, coach and leadership expert who has over 20 years' experience in helping leaders and teams unlock their potential. In the wake of the pandemic, many of us are doubting ourselves more than ever before. We've been living with a heightened sense of anxiety, and with our usual support networks removed, it's been hard to stay focused, resilient and confident in our abilities. So today, Rob is here to talk about how we can help quieten our inner critic, boost our self-confidence and move beyond imposter syndrome by asking 3 simple questions. Intrigued? Me too.
Thank you, Amy. My name's Rob Cross and I'm the author of this book, The Great Man is Dead, A New Philosophy for Leadership. I don't think it's particularly surprising that the environment we're living in today is full of complete confusion and chaos, where we're each trying to navigate through what it means in our day-to-day lives. In the face of that though, I think our number one priority has to be on looking after our own health and well-being, and then the health and well-being of those people around us. Unfortunately, as we look at the world, I think that we've created a society that's conspiring against us, not actually helping us. And what I mean by that is that we've created this society that holds us locked in the shadows of others, feeling like an imposter, as opposed to being drawn into the light as our full potential self. To explain a little more about that, let me tell you a quick story. So when I was younger, I grew up in a small country town in Victoria, Australia, and I had some really interesting experiences, as you can see there. And that's me looking quite anxious as a little scout. And interestingly, on the right-hand side is my brother, who's trying to stand away from the crowd. Although I had some really interesting experiences as a child, my childhood was filled with anxiety and fear. And my brother and sister and I basically lived in this perpetual state of fear about what would happen if we stepped out of line. And that's not because my parents were particularly evil people. I think they were just trying to do the best job that they could with the scripts they had for what being a parent meant. Unfortunately for my brother and sister, that led to some pretty dire consequences, and they eventually both ran away from home. Rather than escape in that way, I escaped in a different way. And the way I escaped was to actually become an overachiever. And I worked really hard. I was fortunate that I was quite good at certain things. And eventually I went through and I graduated with 2 first-class honours degrees from university and then ended up in the Air Force. And whilst a lot of people were quite impressed with what I'd achieved, especially considering some of my experiences in earlier life, what they didn't see behind this thin veneer of an ego was the deep scars of insecurity and fear. You know, I was absolutely an imposter. That's how I felt each and every day. And whilst I tried to portray this overconfident image to make sense of my world and to show that I couldn't be harmed, actually what I was really was a scared little boy. Now that journey continued through my early career, and I was quite lucky that certain people in the Air Force helped me along, saw my potential and got me involved in things, but that didn't ease the sense of anxiety that I had. That journey continued up until when I was about 25, which is when this photo was taken. And at that point I was in the Air Force, and I'd been selected to go on to a training course to learn how to be an internal consultant within the Air Force. And I was away in Lismore, New South Wales in Australia to study my MBA. And through that journey I started recognising that actually I was deeply afraid, and I was locked in this place of feeling like an imposter. And that continued until one day Neil Gilmore, who's the gentleman on the right-hand side with the wine glass in his hand, in a lunchroom where he and I were just sitting there, he said this to me. He said, you know, Rob, you could really be something if you just learned to be comfortable in your own skin. And at that moment I sat there, just he and I, go, where did that come from? Oh my God, he's found me out. He's found me out. He's realised that I'm a fraud. And before I could say anything or try and sort of recover the situation, in walked everybody else. And for the time that followed that, I started to realise that actually people could see through this thin veneer of an ego that I had. They could see that actually I wasn't as comfortable in my own skin. I wasn't as confident as I made out to be. What that simple comment that you can see there, what that did is that set in motion a range of things for me that actually taught me a lot about life and taught me how to move beyond imposter syndrome so I could focus on my own health and well-being, and I could learn to live in a different way. Unfortunately, what happened soon after that is that within a few months, Neil, Jeff, who's the guy in the middle, and I ended up in Adelaide. We were on a project together, and then we all went our separate ways. Within 2 months of getting home, Neil died all of a sudden, left 4 daughters behind and his wife. And Jeff and I became incredibly close friends, closer than family. And we really struggled to make sense of why would such a fantastic individual who could just bring reality to people in such a unique way pass away so meaninglessly. Life continued on past that, as it always does, and I eventually ended up on the other side of the world in the UK. Fraz and I, Jeff Fraser, we became incredibly close friends, even closer, even though we were so far apart. And we got to know each other even better, and he was probably the one person that I could be truly honest with. Unfortunately, 7 years after Neil died, I got a phone call one morning from Jeff's fiance, basically telling me that he had died as well. And for anybody who's experienced that type of thing, you know what it does to you. You know, extreme tragedy that sort of throws you into the abyss of the human existence as you try to make sense about what is life all about, why are we here, how does this work? And I pulled up this photo and I looked at it and said, how am I the only one left of these 3 individuals, these 3 fantastic individuals? And in the months that followed Jeff's death and his funeral, I was absolutely in the abyss. You know, I threw myself into this place of despair where I couldn't stand to be alive myself, where I couldn't make sense about how these 2 fantastic individuals died, yet I was still here, and I didn't feel worthy of that. And whilst I wasn't going to take my own life in the way that I had seen some others around me do over the years, I was doing everything I could to taunt death. I completely let go of any sense of looking after myself and trying to live and live well. And that continued on until one day I was sitting by the Thames in Wapping, and I'll admit I was sitting there having this rambling, drunk conversation with myself, struggling to make sense of it. And that's where I woke up. And in that conversation, I was saying, well, why them? Why them? Why them? Why not me? Why not me? Take me instead. Swap my life. You know, I'll gladly give it up. I'll gladly let go. You know, just bring one of them back. I don't mind which one. Just bring one of them back. And all of a sudden, something popped into my head, a different voice. And this voice said, well, perhaps they beat you to it, Rob. Perhaps as you're trying to say, take me, not them, perhaps they did that for you. Perhaps they were the ones that actually swapped their life so you could live. And in that moment, the voice said to me, so don't you owe it to them to live and to live well? Now, I'm not a believer in sort of the mystical, magical nature of that voice. I think it was my mind working with me to help me bring sense to my situation. And I know that each one of us has to sort of make sense of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. But actually what that voice told me is that actually when we get to it, our health and responsibility, our health and well-being is our own responsibility, and it's up to us for how we really manage that. And the journey that I went on following that moment really taught me 2 things. Firstly, it taught me that actually we are all human beings. We're not perfect creatures. You know, we have our imperfections. We are magnificent and vulnerable in equal measure. And the best thing we can do to really help manage our health and well-being is to embrace our humanity. And the second thing it taught me, and especially through that situation with Neil and Jeff, is that life is going to be a roller coaster. We're constantly going to have ups and downs. We're constantly going to have things thrown at us which really challenge us and confront us in terms of who we are and why we're here. And the best thing we can do is to really keep focused on maintaining our resilience by focusing on our self-care and self-talk. That's the things that we can do each and every day to take care of ourselves, and the stories that we're telling ourselves that keep us trapped in a certain sense of reality. And you take it back from my story sitting on the Thames, on the edge of the Thames, I went from this feeling guilty to actually saying, Rob, it's your responsibility. What are you going to do about it? Now, as I bring that to the current day, I think we are living in chaotic and confusing times, like I said at the start. And as I said, society, I think, is conspiring against us. And what I mean by that is we're constantly being bombarded in every moment by information, disinformation, facts and opinions, and we're sitting there trying to make sense of all of that. And unfortunately for us as human beings, and this has been really heightened throughout COVID, is it's thrust in our face our sense of vulnerability, and that's caused us to have this heightened sense of anxiety. And so there's a lot of authors out there who will say, yes, we should embrace our vulnerability, we should express our vulnerability. Now, as human beings, that's just not natural. It's not a natural thing for us to do. You know, back to our sort of, our origins as a species, expressing our vulnerability feels like we're walking into the middle of the savannah, waiting for the lions to circle us and attack us. And it's no wonder that as we start to feel greater levels of vulnerability, we feel more anxious. And I'm not talking necessarily about sort of clinical anxiety there, albeit I think that is becoming more prominent. I'm talking about this heightened sense of unease about, well, what does the future hold? And as you think through the last 12 months of COVID, that has been the prevailing thing of, well, I don't know what I need to do next. And as we look forward, that sense of anxiety is going to continue. I think perpetuating that is this concept, which I talk about a lot in my book, is the great man theory. Is that whilst we're sitting in this place of vulnerability and anxiety, of confusion, we're also being bombarded by all these images telling us that we need to be this great celebrity individual, that the people that we put up on a pedestal and we're told that this is what success is all about. And unfortunately, as we do that, we take these people and we put them up onto a pedestal, and then we stand in their shadows, marveling at them, looking at them, going, well, is that what I'm told I should be? But actually, that's not what I want to be. That's not who I want to be. So who do I want to be? And the unfortunate thing about all of that is when we mix that chaos and confusion, the vulnerability and anxiety, along with this standing in the shadows of others, is that we get caught in this environment. We get caught perceiving that we're surrounded by perfect specimens of human beings who are all, perfect in terms of image and lifestyle. Scroll through Instagram and tell me what you see. You see all these fantastic lives of people, the things that they do, the meals that they eat, etc. And then we feel like that we're this character who's having to dress up to fit in with that. And so we get locked in imposter syndrome. And as I think about what's happened over the last 12 months, and interestingly through my own career, through my own life, and then over my professional career as I've worked with leaders right across the world, I think imposter syndrome is the number one thing that's impacting people's performance. It's the thing that keeps them locked in this space where they're never quite fulfilling their potential, and they're never quite getting there in terms of really being all that they can be, because they're always worried about being found out, being called out to be a fraud that they feel like they are. And unfortunately, I think through the COVID period, this concept of imposter syndrome has caused the inner critic to become louder, and people are more fearful of actually confronting that story that they're telling themselves, of that critic is calling out to them, and actually becoming more comfortable in themselves. As people go to deal with that, unfortunately, I think what's happening also is that people get caught in this concept of a house built on sand. They look at all the different things that they could do, the tools and techniques, the different diets, exercise regimes, whatever it might be, and they start applying that. And that's the stuff that I call the house. And some of it's okay, some of it is absolute gimmicky nonsense. And unfortunately, if we only focus on that house stuff, the tools and techniques, the different things we could try, and we never focus on the foundations in terms of our identity, purpose and practice for how we live, and that's about how are we going to live and how are we going to live well, then it doesn't matter what you do at the surface level. It doesn't matter how strong the house is. If you haven't been the foundations for yourself in terms of embracing humanity and courage and conviction in your own sense of being a human, then actually it doesn't matter, because you'll never develop that real confidence in who you are. And so to really quieten that inner critic, to help people move beyond imposter syndrome so that you can really focus on your health and well-being, we have to start by understanding what it means to be a human. And often we describe the human condition in the form of an iceberg, and what sits above the surface is people's behaviour. It's what people say and do. And what sits below the surface is our values, beliefs and fears. Unfortunately, if we limit ourselves to that perspective, what happens is that we never get to the core of what does it really mean to be a human being. We never comprehend these tensions that sit within us that really influence and drive our everyday behaviour. And because we don't do that, we allow the critic to continue. We allow ourselves to feel like an imposter rather than feeling like a confident, capable human being. So when I went on my journey, post the stories that I've told, I went looking for what really drives human behaviour, and this is what I found. I found these things called human dilemmas, and they are the existential dilemmas that drive us. They are the things that are irreconcilable, that are ever present, that if we ignore, will continue to feed our behaviour, whether we like it or not. And what I discovered by digging into them is that actually, if we can tap into those, and this is where the 3 questions become really important, if we can tap into those, they give us huge amounts of energy in terms of how we move beyond imposter syndrome and how we get really focused on our own lives. And the human dilemmas start with mortality. Whether we like it or not, we're mortal creatures. We have this biological limitation. And with that limitation, that means we're constantly driven. Our primary driver is our safety and security. And you think about what's happened over COVID, number one is safety and security. Can I pay the mortgage? Am I going to get COVID? What is it going to mean for me if I do? And so we really focus on our safety and security first and foremost. Beyond that, we then look at our identity. All of us are conscious of our identity, how we show up each day, how we present ourselves, and our identity influences which tribe we're a part of. And how we show up is what people will talk to, how people will respond to us. And so that really heavily influences, which tribe we're a part of, and actually how people engage with us in our day-to-day lives. The third is we're meaning-making creatures, is that whether we like it or not, we need to have a reason for why things are happening. We need to have a reason for why certain things have occurred and how they've impacted us. And when we can't find that reason, we make it up. We say things like, it's fate or it's Murphy's Law. And when I talk about meaning with people, I'm not talking about some type of Simon Sinek, sort of great man life purpose. I'm talking about just, we need to have an understanding about what's important to us, why it's important to us, and how it's driving our lives. And then the fourth is freedom, is that as human beings, we have this paradoxical relationship with freedom. We are free to choose, and even not making a choice is still a choice. And so with this freedom is that we're confronted every day by choices that we have to make that we can't escape. And what binds all of those together is the fact that we are isolated human beings. I can ask people for advice, I can seek out their guidance, but actually, ultimately, I have to make decisions for myself and by myself, and I can't escape that. And so these human dilemmas are there, they're ever present. I don't encourage people to dwell on them because I don't think that's necessarily healthy. But we can understand that actually they're the reason that we're not always honest with ourselves and honest with others. But actually, if we recognise that they're there and we recognise that they are driving our behaviour, then if we're going to move beyond imposter syndrome, which gives us the freedom and space to focus more on our health and well-being, then actually, why don't we tap into them? Why don't we use them in a way that gives us greater confidence in ourselves and who we are? And the way we do that is through asking and answering 3 simple questions. The first question is this: who am I? Which taps directly into your sense of identity. And that's about saying, well, who do I authentically want to be? How do I want to show up in the world? And do I feel comfortable in my own skin? That's about saying, actually, in every environment I operate, when I walk into a room, how do I feel about myself? And do I feel really confident as that person? Not that I'm trying to emulate somebody else, but when I look in the mirror, I feel confident. The second question, which taps into our sense of meaning, is all about recognising, well, what's important to us in any moment? And as I said, rather than some type of grand life purpose, this is about saying, what brings me purpose in my life? What drives me? What helps me feel like I'm making a valid contribution to myself and to those people around me? And so this is what helps give you real direction in terms of how you're travelling as the person that you truly authentically want to be. And the final question is all about, how do we direct our energy? So if that's who you are and that's why you're here, how will I lead and live is all about, how will I direct my energy in a more mindful way? How will I direct it in a way that actually allows me to be mindful with my intention, to recognise that I won't always get it right, but when I drift off the path of being who I am and serving my purpose, I bring myself back. And that's about making sure that we're really conscious about how we spend our time and how we invest our energy. And what that does is it ultimately allows you to connect with a different sense of community. It allows you to feel more comfortable in your own skin. It allows you to live with greater sense of purpose and confidence in who you are and where you're investing your time and energy, and allows you to invest that time and energy in a mindful way so you're not being distracted by noise and nonsense. So when we bring all of that together, as I said at the start, I think we are living in incredibly chaotic and confusing times, and I think that's going to continue, unfortunately. I think the pace and complexity of change for us as human beings is only going to accelerate, even as we go through post-COVID. I think when we look at that though, rather than allowing ourselves to get trapped in the sense of feeling like an imposter, we need to find a way to get beyond that. And that means actually finding greater confidence and courage in being a human being, in being ourselves as a human being. And the way we do that is that we learn to understand what it means to be a human being, but then embrace our humanity, embrace that we're not perfect creatures, embrace who we are as a human being. And at the same time as that, we need to focus on how we build and maintain our resilience through really engaging this concept of self-care, where we focus on those things that are going to keep us energized and keep us focused, and self-talk in terms of the story that we're telling ourselves. And within all of that, and to give us the foundations for doing that well and learning to live and live well, is 3 simple questions. Who am I? Why am I here? And how will I lead and live? Because once you start answering those questions, actually you learn to live and lead with greater confidence in terms of who you are, a greater sense of purpose, and you apply your energy in a more mindful way. Thank you.